Kyle Morrison checked his uniform one last time before stepping off the transport ship and onto Valorian soil for the first time in human history, and his hands shook slightly, despite 3 years of diplomatic training. The planet stretched before him in shades of purple and silver with crystalline towers, reaching into a sky that held 2 suns, and massive flying creatures circled overhead, making sounds like thunder mixed with music. Commander Lisa Grant stood beside him, reviewing the mission parameters on her datapad, and her voice was steady. Despite the historic nature of their arrival on this alien world, remember, Kyle? She said without looking up from her screen. The Valorians are warrior people, and they value strength and directness. Above all else, in whatever you do, don't make any casual comments about their appearance. Kyle nodded and tried to remember everything from the briefing files about the elf-like aliens who had dominated this sector of space for over 2,000 years before humans even discovered fire. A delegation of Valorian guards approached the landing platform, and their armor caught the double sunlight in ways that hurt to look at directly, and each one carried weapons that hummed with energy. Kyle didn't recognize. The lead guard was female, and stood nearly 7 feet tall with silver markings on her face that indicated high rank, according to the files Kyle had studied, and she gestured for them to follow without speaking. They walked through, streets filled with Valorians going about their daily business, and Kyle noticed how every single one of them stopped to stare at the humans, with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Children pointed and whispered while their parents pulled them back, and merchants in the market square went silent as the human delegation passed, and the weight of being the first humans here settled on Kyle's shoulders. The palace rose before them like a mountain carved from a single piece of crystal, and guards lined every entrance with those same humming weapons held at attention, and Kyle wondered if this was honor or threat. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the walls seemed to pulse with light from within, while tapestries showing ancient battles covered every surface, and Kyle saw humans depicted in several of them, looking primitive and weak. Commander Grant leaned close and whispered that the Valorians had observed Earth for centuries and considered humans fascinating but dangerous, and this meeting would determine if diplomatic relations were even possible. They entered a vast chamber with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows, and the floor was polished stone that reflected everything like dark water, and at the far end sat an empty throne carved from black crystal. The guards positioned Kyle and Lisa in the center of the room, and then retreated to the walls, leaving them standing alone and exposed while unseen observers watched from balconies above. Music began playing from somewhere, and it was like nothing Kyle had ever heard, with notes that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his chest, and the hair on his arms stood up. A door opened, and 2 massive shapes entered the chamber first, and Kyle froze as he realized they were dragons, but not like any mythical creature from Earth stories, and these were real and terrifying. The dragons were easily 20 feet long, with scales that shifted colors from blue to green to purple, and their eyes glowed with intelligence that was unmistakably aware and predatory. Behind the dragons walked a woman, and Kyle forgot to breathe for a moment as she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had trained for combat every day of her life. Her armor was lighter than the guards, but somehow looked more dangerous, and weapons hung from her belt that Kyle couldn't identify, and her face was sharp and beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel. But what caught his attention and held it was her hair, and it flowed behind her like liquid silver, catching both suns' light through the high windows and seeming to glow from within. The woman stopped before the throne, but didn't sit, and instead she turned to face the humans, with eyes the color of deep violet that seemed to look through Kyle rather than at him. Commander Grant stepped forward and began the formal greeting that had been prepared by the diplomatic corps back on Earth, and her voice carried through the chamber with practiced confidence. The elf woman listened without expression, and when Lisa finished speaking, the silence stretched uncomfortably, and Kyle felt sweat forming despite the cool temperature. Then those violet eyes shifted to Kyle, and he felt pinned in place like a specimen under examination, and the dragons moved slightly as if sensing their master's interest. The elf woman spoke, and her voice was musical, but carried an edge like a blade being drawn, and Kyle didn't understand the words but knew they were directed at him. A translator stepped forward from the shadows and repeated her words in standard English, asking what Kyle Morrison's purpose was in this chamber, and why he stared so openly. Kyle knew he should say something, diplomatic and rehearsed, but his brain was still processing the sight of actual dragons and an elf warrior queen standing before him. His mouth opened and the worst possible words came out without permission from his brain, and he said, "Nice hair," like he was talking to someone at a casual party instead of an alien queen. The chamber exploded into chaos as guards rushed forward, and the dragons raised their heads with smoke curling from their nostrils, and Commander Grant turned to stare at Kyle with absolute horror. The elf woman held up one hand and everything stopped moving, and she walked slowly toward Kyle with her eyes never leaving his face, and each step seemed to echo forever. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Kyle could see the silver flecks in her violet eyes and smell something like ozone and winter snow. The translator spoke again, and his voice shook as he repeated her words, and Kyle felt his blood turn cold as the meaning registered. "You have just proposed marriage to Queen Elira of Valoria, and by our laws she may accept or demand you prove your worth through combat to the death." Kyle tried to speak, but his throat had gone completely dry, and the queen continued staring at him with an expression that might have been anger or amusement, and he honestly couldn't tell. Commander Grant started to step forward, but guards blocked her path, and Kyle was alone facing a queen who could apparently kill him legally because he complimented her hair queen. Elira spoke again, and the translator repeated her words carefully, telling Kyle that she would grant him one chance to explain his intentions, and that his life depended on his answer. The dragons moved closer, and their hot breath washed over Kyle, making his eyes water, and he realized that human-Valorian relations might end before they truly began. He took a breath and decided that the truth was his only option, even if it sounded ridiculous, and he began to explain what he meant, while the queen listened with tilted head. But before he could finish his explanation, Queen Elira laughed, and the sound was like bells mixed with steel, and she gestured to her guards, who relaxed slightly. She spoke directly to Kyle without waiting for translation, and somehow he understood the tone, if not the words, and she was amused rather than angry. The translator explained that the queen found humans even more interesting than reports had suggested, and that Kyle would remain as her guest while she decided his fate. Commander Grant protested, but more guards appeared and gently but firmly escorted her toward the exit, and Kyle watched his only ally being removed from the chamber queen. Elira circled Kyle slowly with her dragons following, and she spoke continuously while the translator struggled to keep up with her rapid words. Kyle learned that he would live in the palace and study Valorian customs, and if he survived one full cycle of their year, she would decide whether his words were insult or honor. The queen stopped her circling and stood before him again, and she reached out to touch his face with fingers that were cool and gentle despite their obvious strength. She said something that made the translator blush before, repeating that Kyle was now bound to her by ancient law, and that breaking such bonds meant death for both parties. Kyle felt the weight of his mistake settling over him as the reality became clear, and he was trapped on an alien world bound to a queen he didn't know by words he hadn't meant. Queen Elira smiled, and it was not entirely kind, as she gestured for guards to escort Kyle to his new quarters, and the dragons watched him with those glowing, intelligent eyes. As he was led away, Kyle looked back once and saw the queen still standing there touching her silver hair, with an expression he couldn't read, and his future stretched uncertain before him. The quarters they assigned Kyle were larger than his entire apartment back on Earth, but felt like a prison. Despite the luxury and crystalline walls let in the double sunlight while guards stood outside his door at all times, he spent the first night pacing and trying to figure out how a simple compliment had turned into a binding marriage proposal, and his communication device had been confiscated, so he couldn't contact Commander Grant or anyone from Earth. Morning came with a servant entering his room without knocking, and the small Valorian woman carried clothing that looked like a mixture of formal wear and light armor, and she gestured impatiently for Kyle to change. The outfit fit perfectly despite no measurements being taken, and Kyle wondered if the Valorians had technology that could scan him, or if they were just that good at estimating and the fabric felt like silk but moved like it could stop a blade. The servant led him through corridors that twisted in ways that seemed impossible, and Kyle tried to memorize the path, but gave up after the fifth turn that seemed to loop back on itself. They emerged into a courtyard where Queen Elira stood with Her 2 dragons, and she was dressed for combat training with weapons laid out on a nearby table, and her silver hair was bound back in an intricate braid. "Good morning, Lieutenant Morrison," she said in perfect English, and Kyle stopped in shock because yesterday she had only spoken Valorian and her accent was slight but definitely present. "You speak English," he said, and immediately regretted stating the obvious. But the Queen just smiled as she selected a long blade from the table. "I speak 17 languages, including 3 human ones," she replied, and tested the balance of the weapon with casual expertise. "And yesterday was a formal ceremony where only Valorian could be spoken. But today we begin your education." Kyle watched as she moved through a series of practice forms, and her movements were so fast they blurred, and the blade sang through the air with each strike, and the dragons watched their master with obvious pride. She stopped suddenly and turned to face him while still holding the sword, and her violet eyes studied him with that same intense focus from yesterday. "Tell me, Kyle Morrison," she said, and gestured for him to come closer. "Why did you really compliment my hair and don't give me the answer you gave yesterday? Because we both know there was more to it." He approached cautiously and tried to think of how to explain without making things worse, and the dragons shifted their positions to keep him in their line of sight. "Your hair was the first thing I noticed," he admitted, "and it seemed to hold light in a way that shouldn't be possible. And for just a moment you looked less like a queen and more like someone I might have wanted to meet under different circumstances." Queen Elira tilted her head, and something in her expression softened slightly before her warrior mask returned, and she set down the sword and picked up 2 wooden practice staffs. "We will train together," she announced, and tossed one staff to Kyle, who barely caught it. "And you will learn our ways. And perhaps I will learn something about humans beyond what reports have told me." The training was brutal, and Kyle had combat experience from his military service, but the Queen moved like water and struck like lightning, and within minutes he was on his back staring at the sky. She offered her hand to help him up, and her grip was strong but not crushing, and she actually smiled when he got back to his feet. Immediately, "You don't stay down?" she observed, and there was approval in her voice, and that is very human according to our studies, and you fall but you rise and you keep fighting even when victory is impossible. They trained for hours, and Kyle lost count of how many times he ended up on the ground. But each time he stood back up, and each time the Queen seemed slightly more interested. The dragons eventually moved closer, and the larger one with blue-green scales nudged Kyle with its massive head and nearly knocked him over again. "His name is Storm Queen," Elira said, and watched carefully as Kyle reached out to touch the dragon scales, and they were warm and felt like polished stone. "And he is curious about you because you smell different from Valorians." The smaller dragon with purple scales approached and bumped against Kyle's other side, and the Queen laughed at his startled expression. "That is Shadow, and she rarely approaches anyone outside our family." And Queen Elira's voice held surprise. "And you must have made quite an impression for both of them to accept you." Kyle found himself standing between 2 massive dragons while an alien queen watched, and somehow this felt less threatening than the throne room encounter. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked while stroking Shadow's scales. "And I mean, why not just send me back to Earth and forget I said anything?" Queen Elira was quiet for a long moment, and she moved to stand beside him while looking at her dragons rather than at him. "Because in 2,000 years of observing humans," she said slowly, "no human has ever been allowed on Valoria until you and your companion arrived, and our council is divided about whether your species can be trusted." She turned to face him, and her expression was serious and almost vulnerable. "Your words yesterday were a mistake, but they created an opportunity," she continued. "And if you can learn our ways and respect our customs, then perhaps you prove humans are worth knowing, and if you fail, then the council has their answer." Kyle understood suddenly that he wasn't just fighting for his own life, but for the future of human-Valorian relations, and the weight of that responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders. "What if I can't learn fast enough?" he asked, and the Queen smiled, but it was sad rather than amused. "Then you die, and humans are forever banned from our space," and she said it so calmly that Kyle felt his blood chill, and the vote was already close, and many want you gone regardless. They stood in silence while the dragons pressed closer as if offering comfort, and Kyle made a decision that would change everything. "Then teach me," he said, and met her eyes directly, "and teach me everything I need to know, and I promise I will learn or die trying." Queen Elira studied him for another long moment and then nodded once. "As if he had passed some test. Tomorrow we begin your real education," she said. "And today was just to see if you had the spirit to survive." And she walked toward the palace entrance and paused to look back. "And Kyle Morrison," she added with a slight smile, "your compliment yesterday was not entirely unwelcome, even if your timing was catastrophic." She left him standing with the dragons, and Kyle felt Storm rumble with what might have been laughter. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of training and lessons, and Kyle learned the Valorian language and customs and combat techniques and the history of a civilization older than human writing. Queen Elira was a demanding teacher, but fair, and she never asked him to do anything she wouldn't demonstrate first, and slowly, Kyle began to understand the complexity of Valorian culture. He learned that compliments about appearance were reserved for family or intended mates, and that warriors earned the right to decorative elements through combat achievements, and that Queen Elira's silver hair marked her as undefeated in formal challenge. He learned that the dragons were not pets, but partners who chose their companions, and that only the royal line had ever bonded with the great drakes, and that Storm and Shadow were over 300 years old. He learned that the Valorians had watched humanity climb from caves to stars, and feared human unpredictability while admiring human resilience, and that this first contact would determine if the two species could coexist. Each evening Kyle would eat dinner with the Queen in a private dining hall, and they would discuss the day's lessons, and she would correct his pronunciation and occasionally share stories about her own life. One night after a particularly difficult training session, Queen Elira asked him about Earth and what he missed most about his home world. Kyle thought about it while sipping a drink that tasted like honey and lightning, and he finally answered that he missed the simplicity of knowing the rules. "Here, everything I say or do could mean something completely different," she said, "and I feel like I am walking through a minefield." And the Queen laughed at his metaphor. "That is how we feel about humans," she replied, "and your species does the most unexpected things, and you break every rule and somehow survive and even thrive, and it terrifies us." She leaned forward and her expression was intense. "And you stood in my throne room and complimented my hair as if we were equals, and no Valorian would ever dare such familiarity." "Was it really that offensive?" Kyle asked, and the Queen shook her head slowly. "No," she said quietly, "and that is what frightens the council most. And it was bold and foolish and somehow charming and very, very human." They sat in comfortable silence, and Kyle realized that somewhere between the combat training and language lessons, he had stopped being afraid and started being curious. Queen Elira stood and moved to the window, overlooking the city, and her silver hair caught the light from both moons rising. "In 3 months you have learned what takes most Valorians years," she said without turning, "and you still make mistakes. But you learn from them and you don't make the same error twice." She turned to face him, and something in her expression had changed. "The council meets in 1 week to vote on permanent human presence, and your progress will be part of their decision." And Kyle felt his stomach drop. "What happens if they vote no?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you return to Earth and the borders close and humanity remains alone in its corner of space," she replied, and her voice carried regret. "And what happens to you?" Kyle asked, and saw her surprise. "At the question I remain queen and I follow the will of the council," she said, but something in her eyes suggested it wouldn't be that simple. The week ahead would determine everything, and Kyle spent restless nights staring at alien stars and wondering if his accidental proposal would save or doom human-Valorian relations. The morning before the council vote, Kyle woke to find Storm and Shadow both pressed against his door, and their massive forms blocked the entire hallway, and when he opened the door they pushed inside his quarters without invitation. "Something is wrong." Storm rumbled, and Kyle had learned enough to understand the dragon's telepathic communication, and the Queen is in danger from those who oppose the human alliance. Shadow added her own thoughts and showed Kyle images of council members meeting in secret and plotting something that felt dark and threatening. The morning before the council vote, Kyle woke to find Storm and Shadow both pressed against his door, and their massive forms blocked the entire hallway, and when he opened the door they pushed inside his quarters without invitation. "Something is wrong." Storm rumbled, and Kyle had learned enough to understand the dragon's telepathic communication, and the Queen is in danger from those who oppose the human alliance. Shadow added her own thoughts and showed Kyle images of council members meeting, in secret, and plotting something that felt dark and threatening. Kyle dressed quickly in the formal Valorian clothing he had been given and tried to figure out what to do. And he couldn't reach Queen Elira directly, because protocol demanded he wait. For summons, the dragons had no such restrictions, and they led him through passages he hadn't seen before and down stairs that seemed to descend into the very heart of the palace. They emerged in a chamber where Queen Elira stood surrounded by 5 council members, and their body language screamed hostility even before Kyle understood their words. The queen saw him enter, and her eyes widened in surprise, and then narrowed in warning. But Kyle was already committed. "What is happening here?" he demanded. In Valorian, and his accent was still rough, but the words were clear. One of the council members turned, and his face showed disgust, and his armor marked him as high military rank. "The human dares interrupt a private council session," he said. "And this proves they have no respect for our ways." Queen Elira stepped forward and placed herself between Kyle and the angry council member. "Lieutenant Morrison is my responsibility," she said, and her voice carried authority that made even the council member pause, "and I will handle his breach of protocol." But another council member spoke up, and this one was female with scars that marked her as a veteran of many battles. "This is exactly what we feared," she said, "and humans are chaos, and they break every rule, and now one stands before the council uninvited, and what will stop them from doing worse?" Kyle realized he had made a terrible mistake, but Storm pushed past him and positioned himself beside the queen, and the dragon growled deep in his chest. "The human was summoned by us." One council member stammered, and he stepped back from the massive dragon, "and we did not know the dragons had taken such interest." Queen Elira turned to look at Kyle, and her expression was unreadable. But her next words changed. "Everything, is this true?" she asked, "and did my companions bring you here?" Kyle nodded and tried to find words to explain, and Storm showed me images, and he said, "You were in danger." The council members exchanged glances, and something shifted in the atmosphere, and the hostility decreased slightly but was replaced by uncertainty. "Dragons do not lie," the scarred female council member said slowly. "And if they brought the human, then they sensed something, and perhaps we should listen." Queen Elira crossed her arms and faced her council with a warrior's stance, and she spoke in rapid Valorian that Kyle struggled to follow completely. But he caught enough to understand she was defending him and pointing out that he had responded to perceived danger to her, despite the risk, and that such loyalty deserved consideration. One council member who had remained silent until now finally spoke, and his voice was old and tired. "The question before us has always been whether humans can adapt to our ways while keeping what makes them unique," she said. "And this morning we have our answer." He gestured to Kyle standing between 2 dragons with palace guards now filling the doorway behind him. "A human who learns our language in 3 months and who comes running when he believes his teacher is threatened, and who shows respect while maintaining his own honor." The other council members began discussing this in rapid Valorian, and Kyle lost track of the conversation. But he watched Queen Elira's face and saw hope, replacing the tension. Finally, the eldest council member raised his hand for silence, and the room immediately quieted. "We will move the vote forward to today," she announced, "and the human will be present to hear our decision and his fate and humanity's. Fate will be decided before sunset." Kyle felt his heart hammering as guards escorted him to a waiting chamber, and Queen Elira squeezed his shoulder briefly before she was led away to prepare. He sat alone for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and his mind raced through everything that could go wrong. The door opened, and Commander Lisa Grant entered, looking tired but relieved, and she rushed forward to embrace him briefly. "I heard what happened," she said, and the Valorians allowed me back into the palace for the vote. "And Kyle Morrison, you have caused more diplomatic incidents in 3 months than most ambassadors do in careers." Kyle managed a weak smile and sat beside her while they waited, and Lisa told him about the negotiations happening on Earth and how every government was watching Valoria. "Did I ruin everything?" he asked, and Lisa shook her head firmly. "You did what humans do best," she replied, "and you improvised and adapted and showed them who we really are, and now we wait to see if that was enough." A guard appeared and gestured for them to follow, and they walked through the palace toward the great council chamber, and Kyle noticed that Valorian citizens lined the hallways watching him pass. Some faces showed anger, but others showed curiosity, and a few even nodded respectfully. And Kyle realized his story had spread throughout the palace, and probably the entire city. The council chamber was packed with observers, and Kyle saw Queen Alira standing beside her, throne with Storm and Shadow flanking her, and her silver hair was unbound and flowed over her armor. The council members sat in a semicircle, and their faces were grave, as Kyle and Lisa were positioned in the center of the room. The eldest council member stood and spoke in both Valorian and English so everyone could understand. We gathered a vote on whether humanity will be welcomed as allies or turned away from our space forever, and this decision will echo through generations. She paused and looked directly at Kyle before continuing. 3 months ago, a human lieutenant stood in this chamber and spoke words that by our law created a bond, and many believe this proved human recklessness and unsuitability. But in the time since we have watched this human learn our ways, and we have seen him adapt without losing himself, and we have witnessed both his mistakes and his growth. Another council member stood, and his voice was the military commander who had been hostile that morning. Opposed the human presence, she said, and I believed they would bring chaos, and I was not wrong. But I have learned that sometimes chaos is not weakness, but strength. He turned to address Kyle directly. And you broke protocol this morning, and you entered, where you were not invited, but you did so because you feared for the queen, and that is the action of a warrior, not a diplomat. The scarred female council member stood next, and her voice was thoughtful. Humans are everything we feared, she said, and they are unpredictable, and they break rules and they forge ahead without knowing consequences. But they are also loyal, and they learn, and they protect those they care about. One by one, the council members spoke, and Kyle listened as they debated the future, and some praised his progress while others worried about human nature. Finally, Queen Alira was given permission to speak, and she stepped forward with grace that commanded every eye. This council asked me to test the human, she began, and to determine if his species could walk among us, and I have tested him in combat and in custom and in every way. I know, she turned to look at Kyle, and something in her expression made his breath catch. He has failed many times, she continued, and his pronunciation is still imperfect, and his combat forms need work, and he does not always understand our subtle social cues. But he learns from every failure, and he rises every time he falls, and he has shown respect for our ways while maintaining his human spirit. The queen moved closer to Kyle, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. 3 months ago, he complimented my hair and created a diplomatic crisis, she said, and today he rushed into danger because he thought I needed help, and this is humanity in summary. She turned back to the council, and her voice grew stronger. I vote yes, she declared, and humanity should be welcomed as allies because they will make mistakes, but they will also stand beside us, and they will bring their chaos and their courage, and we will be stronger for it. The eldest council member called for the vote, and one by one the council members stood and voiced their decision. Kyle watched as the votes came in, and his future hung in the balance, and Commander Grant gripped his hand tightly. When the last vote was counted, the eldest council member stood and faced the chamber. By a vote of 8-4, she announced humanity is welcome to Valoria, and diplomatic relations will begin immediately. The chamber erupted in mixed reactions, and some Valorians cheered while others looked dismayed. But the decision was made. Queen Alira walked directly to Kyle and offered her hand in the human custom she had learned. Welcome officially to Valoria, Lieutenant Morrison, she said, and her smile was genuine and warm. Kyle took her hand and tried to find words adequate for the moment, but his voice caught. Your hair really is beautiful, he said. And this time he meant it as more than a casual compliment. The queen laughed, and the sound filled the chamber, and she replied in English so only he could hear. I know, she said, and that is why I voted yes, because only a human would repeat the same mistake and somehow make it mean something completely different. Storm and Shadow approached, and both dragons pressed against Kyle in what was clearly affection, and Queen Alira watched with an expression that held both amusement and something deeper. The formal bonding ceremony was scheduled for the following week, and Kyle spent that time learning exactly what he had accidentally agreed to. And the reality was far more complicated than any human marriage. Queen Elira met him in the palace library, and scrolls covered every surface showing ancient texts about royal bonds, and her expression was serious as she gestured for him to sit. "You need to understand what this means," she said, and pushed a scroll toward him that showed illustrations of previous royal bondings, and these are not just words, and this is magic and biology and politics all combined. Kyle studied the images and saw elf warriors standing with their partners while dragons circled overhead and glowing symbols connected. The bonded pairs, the royal bloodline carries ancient magic, she explained, and her finger traced the symbols in the scroll. And when we bond with someone, that magic extends to them, and it will change you physically and mentally. How much change? Kyle asked, and felt worry creeping into his voice. "You will live as long as I do, which is approximately 800 years, she replied calmly. "And you will develop some ability to communicate with storm and shadow, and your strength and healing will increase significantly." Kyle sat back and tried to process the idea of living 8 centuries, and that was longer than the entire history of human spaceflight. "There is more," Queen Elira continued, "and the bond works both ways, and I will be able to sense your emotions and location, and you will sense mine, and there are no secrets between bonded pairs." She looked directly at him, and her violet eyes were intense. "This is your last chance to walk away," she said. "And once the ceremony is complete, the bond is permanent, and death is the only way to break it, and even our magic cannot undo what will be done." Kyle thought about Earth and his family and the life he had planned before accidentally proposing to an alien queen. And he thought about the past 3 months and everything he had learned. "I am not walking away," he said, and met her gaze steadily. The queen studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. "Why?" she asked. "And you could return to Earth as a hero, and the alliance is secured, and you do not need to bind yourself to me forever. Because in 3 months you have become more real to me than most people." "I knew my entire life," Kyle replied. "And because Storm and Shadow would miss me, and because I want to see what 800 years with you would be like." Queen Elira smiled, and it was the first time Kyle had seen her look genuinely happy, rather than amused or stern. "You are either very brave or very foolish," she said, but her tone was warm, and perhaps that is the same thing. And she stood and offered her hand. "Come," she said, "and there is someone you need to meet before the ceremony." They walked through the palace with Storm and Shadow following, and guards bowed as the queen passed. But Kyle noticed they now bowed to him as well. They descended into gardens that Kyle had not seen before, and the plants here glowed with soft light, and the air smelled like rain and flowers. An ancient Valorian sat on a bench, and her hair was pure white, and her face carried lines of countless years. And when she looked up, her eyes were the same violet as the queen grandmother. Queen Elira said, and spoke in formal Valorian, "And I bring the human who will bond with our line." The old woman studied Kyle with an intensity that made him feel transparent, and she gestured for him to come closer. "Sit, human," she said in accented English, "and let me see what my granddaughter has chosen." Kyle sat and tried not to fidget under that ancient gaze, and the woman reached out to touch his face with fingers that were cool and papery. "You carry fear," she observed, "and also determination and love, and that is a good combination." And she smiled, showing teeth that were still sharp. "The last human who came to Valoria was 300 years ago," she continued, "and he was a warrior who saved my mother's life, and we have long memories of your species. Courage." She released Kyle and turned to her granddaughter. "He will do," she announced, "and the bond will hold. And bring him to the sacred pool on the ceremony day." The week passed quickly, and Kyle barely slept as servants prepared him, and Commander Lisa Grant returned to help him understand the political implications. "You realize this makes you royalty," she said, while watching servants fit him for ceremonial armor. "And Earth is going to lose their minds, and every government will want to use you as a connection to Valoria." Kyle adjusted the armor that felt strange but fit perfectly, and he understood the weight of what was happening. "I did not plan any of this," he reminded her, "and I just complimented her." Hair Lisa laughed and shook her head in amazement. "You complimented her hair, and accidentally created the most important alliance in human history," she said, "and they are going to write books about you and probably get everything wrong." The ceremony day arrived with both suns rising in perfect alignment, and Kyle was led to the sacred pool by guards, who sang in harmonies that made his bones vibrate. The pool was deep in the palace beneath layers of crystal and stone, and the water glowed with its own light, and ancient symbols covered the walls. Queen Alira was already there, and her armor was silver and black, and her hair was woven with gems that caught the water light, and she looked like something from a legend storm. And Shadow waited at the pool's edge, and both dragons hummed with anticipation, and Kyle felt their excitement mixing with his own nervousness. The grandmother queen stood at the water's edge, and she began speaking in Old Valorian that Kyle did not understand but felt in his chest. Queen Alira took his hand and led him into the pool, and the water was warm and seemed to pulse with energy, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. The grandmother queen continued her chanting, and Kyle felt something building in the air like electricity before a storm queen. Alira turned to face him and spoke words in the ancient language, and Kyle repeated them as he had been taught, and with each word the water glowed brighter. The dragons entered the pool and positioned themselves around the couple, and they added their voices to the ceremony, and the sound was like thunder and music combined. Kyle felt the magic beginning, and it started as warmth in his chest and spread through his entire body, and he could feel Queen Alira's presence in his mind like a second heartbeat. The bond formed between them, and Kyle gasped as 800 years of her memories flooded into his awareness, and he felt her strength and her loneliness and her hope. At the same time, she received his memories and his comparatively short life and his fears and dreams and his genuine affection for her that had grown over 3 months. The magic peaked, and Kyle felt his body changing and his senses sharpened and his strength increased, and he could suddenly feel Storm and Shadow's minds touching his. The water around them erupted in light, and the symbols on the walls blazed, and the grandmother queen raised her arms and spoke final words that sealed the bond permanently. When the light faded, Kyle stood changed, and he could feel the magic in his blood, and Queen Alira's emotions were clear as his own, and the dragons nuzzled him with obvious pleasure. The grandmother queen smiled and spoke in English. "It is done, and you are bound until death, and may your years together be filled with wisdom and strength." Queen Alira squeezed his hand, and Kyle felt her joy and nervousness and something deeper that she had not shown him before. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly while servants brought robes to replace their wet ceremonial armor. "Different," Kyle replied, "and I can feel you and the dragons, and everything seems sharper and brighter, and I can hear your heartbeat." "That will fade to background awareness," she assured him, "but the connection remains always." And she touched his face gently, "And I can feel your emotions too, and you are not afraid anymore." "No," Kyle agreed, "and I am not afraid," and he meant it completely. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, and Valorians from across the planet came to witness the first human to bond with their royal line. Kyle met nobles and warriors and common citizens, and each one wanted to touch him or speak with him and understand what humans were really like. Commander Grant attended the celebrations, and she looked exhausted from negotiating with Earth governments who were demanding explanations. "They want you to return for debriefing," she told Kyle during a quiet moment, "and they are afraid you have been compromised or brainwashed." Kyle laughed and looked across the hall where Queen Alira was speaking with council members, and Storm and Shadow lay nearby watching everything. "Tell them I have been changed but not compromised," he said, "and this is where I belong now." Lisa studied him carefully, and then nodded slowly. "You are different," she observed, "and not just physically. And there is something in your eyes that was not there before. 800 years of memories will do that," Kyle replied. "And I know things now that no other human knows, and I have seen the rise and fall of civilizations through her eyes." He turned to face Lisa directly, and his expression was serious. "Humanity needs this alliance," he said. "And the galaxy is far more dangerous than we understood. And the Valorians have been protecting this entire sector from threats we cannot imagine." "What kind of threats?" Lisa asked, and her diplomatic training showed in her careful attention. "The kind that eat planets," Queen Alira said as she joined them, and her hand found Kyle's automatically. "And the kind that we have been fighting for millennia, and the kind that humanity will now help us face." She looked at Kyle, and he felt her determination and pride through their bond. That is why the bonding was so important, she continued. And now humans and Valorians are truly united, and what threatens one threatens both. 6 months after the bonding ceremony, Kyle stood on the command deck of the first joint human-Valorian warship and watched as both species worked together, preparing for a mission that would test everything they had built. The ship was named Unity, and it combined human innovation with Valorian magic, and the result was something neither species could have created, alone. Queen Elira moved beside him, and her armor was battle-ready because they were not heading toward diplomacy, but toward war. Through their bond, Kyle felt her concern mixed with determination, and he reached out to touch her hand briefly. "We are ready," he said, and his confidence was not false because 6 months of training had shown him what humans and Valorians could accomplish. Together, Storm and Shadow waited in the launch bay, and both dragons were fitted with armor that enhanced their natural abilities, and they would fly alongside the ship when battle came. Commander Grant approached with tactical data, and her role had evolved from diplomat to military liaison, and she looked tired but focused. "The enemy fleet is moving faster than expected," she reported, "and they will reach the Valorian colony world of Kestra in 3 days, and the colonists cannot evacuate in time." "How many ships?" Kyle asked and studied the holographic display showing enemy positions. 50 confirmed, Grant replied, "and possibly more hiding in the nebula, and they are using weapons we have never seen before. And Valorian shields are not fully effective, Queen." Elira spoke in rapid Valorian to her officers, and then switched to English for the human crew members. "We will arrive in 2 days," she announced, "and Unity will lead the defense while the colony completes evacuation. And this is exactly why the Alliance exists." Kyle felt her determination through the bond and also her fear not for herself, but for the thousands of lives depending on them. The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, and the combined human-Valorian engine system made the journey smoother than either species' technology alone. During the journey, Kyle worked with both human and Valorian officers, and watched as cultural differences were overcome through necessity and shared purpose. A young human engineer named Danny Chen worked alongside a Valorian technician, and they argued about power distribution in 3 languages before finding a solution neither had considered. "That is what I hope to see," Queen Elira said quietly, and she stood beside Kyle watching the crew work. And they are not human or Valorian, but something new. Through the bond, Kyle felt her emotions shift from worry to hope, and he understood that this mission was about more than saving one colony. "This is the test," he said, "and if we succeed, the galaxy sees what we can do together, and if we fail, the Alliance dies before it truly begins." The Queen nodded, and her hand found his automatically. "We will not fail," she said, and her voice carried absolute conviction, "and because we are stronger together than apart, and that is what humans teach us." Storm contacted Kyle telepathically and showed him images of the approaching battle space, and the dragon could sense danger ahead. 2 days passed quickly, and Unity emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kestra system, and the situation was worse than intelligence had suggested. 70 enemy ships surrounded the colony world, and their weapons had already begun bombardment, and fires burned across the planet's surface, visible even from Space Queen. Elira issued orders in both Valorian and English, and the crew responded with practiced efficiency, and Unity moved to intercept the enemy fleet. The enemy ships were massive and dark, and they used technology that seemed organic rather than mechanical, and their weapons fired beams of energy that twisted space itself. "Shields up," Queen Elira commanded, and the combined human-Valorian defensive systems activated and formed a barrier that shimmered with both technology and magic. The first enemy salvo hit the shields, and Unity shook, but held, and human and Valorian crew members worked together to redistribute power and strengthen weak points. "Return fire," Kyle ordered, and felt strange giving commands on a ship where he was technically consort to the Queen. But she had insisted he serve as tactical officer. Unity's weapons combined human missiles with Valorian energy weapons, and the result was devastating, and 3 enemy ships exploded in the first volley. But more enemy ships moved to surround. Unity and the crew realized they were outnumbered and outgunned. "Storm and Shadow launch," Queen Elira commanded, and the launch bay doors opened and both dragons burst into space. The dragons flew through the vacuum using magic that human scientists still did not understand, and they attacked enemy ships with breath weapons that melted through armor. Unity pressed forward, and more enemy ships exploded. But damage reports came in from all sections, and the ship was taking heavy fire, a human damage. Control team led by Danny Chen rushed to repair a failing power conduit, while Valorian healers tended wounded crew members from both species. Kyle felt the battle through multiple perspectives, and his human tactical training combined with Valorian strategic sense from the Bond and Storm and Shadow's aerial view through their telepathic link. He saw an opportunity that neither species would have noticed alone. "There," Kyle said, and pointed at the holographic display. "And their command ship is hidden behind the planet, and if we take it out, the fleet loses coordination." Queen Elira studied the tactical situation, and her mind raced through possibilities, and Kyle felt her making calculations. "We would have to fly through their entire fleet," she said. "And Unity might not survive, but the colony definitely will not survive if we do not try." Kyle countered and felt her agreement through the bond. "All power to forward shields," the Queen commanded, "and all hands prepare for close quarters, combat, and Storm Shadow, clear us a path." The dragons responded immediately and dove toward the enemy fleet, and their combined breath weapons created an opening. Unity accelerated and charged directly at the enemy formation, and every weapon fired continuously, and enemy ships exploded, but more took their place. The ship shook violently as enemy fire overwhelmed sections of the shields and casualties mounted, and Kyle heard damage reports in multiple languages. Engineering reports power at 60%. Grant called out, and life support is failing on decks 4 and 5. "Keep going," Queen Elira ordered, and her voice cut through the chaos. "And we are almost through." Storm suddenly sent a warning through the bond, and Kyle felt the dragons panic a moment before a massive enemy weapon fired. The blast hit Unity's portside and tore through shields and armor, and the ship spun violently, and Kyle was thrown against his console. Queen Elira grabbed him and pulled him back to his feet, and blood ran down her face from a cut on her forehead, but she ignored it. "Status," she demanded, and crew members rushed to respond. "Main power is down," Grant reported, and her voice shook, "and backup systems are failing, and we are dead in space." The enemy command ship came into view, and it was enormous and covered in weapons that were charging to fire again. Kyle felt desperation rising, but also felt something else. And Storm and Shadow were still fighting, and the dragons refused to give up. Through their bond, he reached out to the dragons and showed them what needed to happen, and both dragons understood immediately. "Storm, Shadow," he called out, "and you need to destroy that command ship, and we will cover you." The dragons dove toward the enemy command ship, and Unity used its last remaining power to fire every weapon at once, creating a distraction. Enemy ships moved to intercept the dragons, but Storm and Shadow flew in patterns that were impossible to predict, and their bond with Kyle let him coordinate their movements. Now Kyle shouted, and both dragons unleashed their most powerful breath weapons simultaneously. The enemy command ship shields collapsed under the combined assault, and the dragons crashed directly into the ship hull and tore it apart from inside. The command ship exploded in a massive fireball, and the shockwave hit Unity and knocked out more systems. But the enemy fleet suddenly lost coordination, and ships began drifting without orders, and some even fired on each other in confusion. Valorian reinforcements arrived at that moment and jumped into the system with a full battle fleet, and the remaining enemy ships retreated into the nebula. Unity floated damaged but intact, and crew members from both species embraced and celebrated survival. Storm and Shadow returned, and both dragons were injured but alive, and they landed in the bay and demanded attention from Kyle and the Queen. Elira moved through the ship, checking on crew members, and Kyle followed, and they saw humans and Valorians working together to repair damage and help. Wounded Danny Chen had severe burns from the power conduit explosion, but refused medical treatment until repairs were complete, and a Valorian healer finally forced him to sit. "You saved the ship," the healer said, and applied treatment that would have seemed like magic to humans 6 months ago. "We all saved the ship," Danny replied and gestured to his mixed species team. "And that is what this alliance means." Kyle found Commander Grant in the tactical center, and she was coordinating with the Valorian fleet to complete colony evacuation. "Casualties?" she asked, without looking up from her display. 43 dead and over 100 wounded, Kyle reported. But we saved 12,000 colonists. Grant finally looked at him and tears ran down her face despite her controlled expression. 43, she repeated, and both humans and Valorians, and they died together. Yes, Kyle said and sat beside her heavily, and they saved each other together too. Queen Elira joined them, and her silver hair was matted with blood and ash, but her violet eyes were fierce with pride.